Hi! In this video, I'm going to talk about sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, and romantic orientation. So whether you consider yourself an expert on these subjects, or you're a bit confused by all the terms I just threw at you, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you enjoy this video and maybe even learn something new. Hello everyone, welcome back. My name's Maddie, and here on this channel we make videos about LGBT issues and mental health. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, consider subscribing. Anyway, welcome to the first video of 2021. I'm sorry it's coming out so late. I have a weird track record of just not uploading in the month of January. And sometimes February. But yeah, lots of things happened, and then even more things happened, and then we ended up in the hospital. Fun stuff. But we're here, we're alive, and I'm still of the opinion that 2021 is going to be an absolutely incredible year. I mean, I just got engaged. Like, that's incredible. I'm really excited about 2021. As for things going on with the channel, keep an eye out for updates about live streams, as we're going to be doing a lot more of those this year. And also, if you're on Discord, then feel free to join our Discord server. Links in the description below. Anyway, last summer I uploaded a video about different gender identities, and I got an interesting comment from someone who said that they didn't quite understand all of the different sexualities I had mentioned in the video. I explained to them that I was actually talking about gender identities and not sexualities, but a few people who I talked to shortly thereafter talked about how they were confused about all of these different aspects of identity and how they relate to one another. So I figured I'd make two different videos. This one is going to be about gender identity and sexuality, along with biological sex, gender expression, and romantic orientation. And then at some point in the future, I'll make a video talking about different sexualities the same way I talked about different gender identities in my video, A Guide to Non-Binary Identities. So first, let's address the difference between gender identity and biological sex. When I was an undergrad, I used to love the saying, sex is between your legs and gender is between your ears, because I thought it explained the fact that gender is psychological and sex is biological in a simple, easy-to-remember way. However, while it is true that sex is rooted in a person's biology, while gender identity has more to do with the way a person's brain is wired, it's a bit of an oversimplification to say that sex is solely based on what's between a person's legs. In fact, I learned from a somewhat controversial yet very insightful video that there are actually 5 different things that we use to determine a person's biological sex: genitalia, gonads, that is testes or ovaries, chromosomes, hormones, and secondary sex characteristics like breasts and facial hair. So while 2 elements of a person's sex, genitalia and gonads, can be found between a person's legs, the other 3 cannot, making the saying I mentioned a little bit ago rather inaccurate. Also, I think it's worth noting that this understanding of biological sex completely disrupts the idea that sex is binary. It is not. Intersex people exist, and they're about as common as people with red hair. Still, biological sex has to do with the way we understand a person's biology based on the characteristics I mentioned above, whereas gender identity has to do with how a person understands and perceives their own internal sense of gender. It is most common for a person's gender identity, who they understand themselves to be, to match up with their biological sex, how their body is structured. However, there are some people, such as yours truly, whose gender identity and biological sex do not match up 100%. People who have a mismatch of gender identity and biological sex are known as transgender, whereas people whose gender identity and biological sex match up are known as cisgender. Before we move on, one thing that's important to note is that gender identity isn't just a feeling. Studies have shown that while there is considerable overlap between male brains and female brains, there are differences between the two, and when taking brain scans of binary trans people, that is, trans people who identify 100% as male or female, their brain scans more closely resembled their gender identity, not their biological sex. As far as I know, this study hasn't been conducted on non-binary people, trans people who don't identify 100% as male or female, but I'm personally of the opinion that the results would be just as affirming of non-binary trans people as they were of binary trans people. So while gender is more psychological than biological, primarily due to the fact that so much of gender is learned, not innate, there does seem to be a biological component to how people identify as well. Hopefully I'm making sense so far, but if any of this is confusing to you, please feel free to ask questions in the comments below. So now that we've established what biological sex and gender identity are, let's move on to gender expression. Gender expression refers to the way we present ourselves to the world. Think hair, clothing, makeup, accessories, vocal patterns, mannerisms, anything we use to express different aspects of personality. For example, if you saw someone with a super short haircut rocking a three-piece suit, you might say that that person has a more masculine gender expression, at least according to Western gender norms. Likewise, someone with long flowing hair wearing a dress and makeup would be expressing their gender in a more feminine way, at least according to Western gender norms. All that being said, I think it's important to remember two things. First, gender expression has a lot to do with societal and cultural trends. For example, did you know that high heels were originally worn by men? They were specifically worn by butchers who would wear them so that their feet wouldn't get soaked by the blood on the ground. And while skirts are considered to be feminine in the dominant Western culture, men wear skirts in places like Scotland, Samoa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, just to name a few. Gender expression varies from culture to culture and changes over time. And second, a person's gender identity does not dictate their sex or gender identity, or their sexuality for that matter. Earlier I mentioned two hypothetical people. The first had a short haircut and was wearing a suit, and the second had long flowing hair and was wearing a dress and makeup. Traditionally, one might assume that the first hypothetical person was a man and the second was a woman, but there's absolutely no reason why this has to be the case. They could both be men. They could both be women. They could both be non-binary, which again means that they don't identify 100% as male or female. Gender expression and gender identity are two separate things which sometimes align with one another, but not always, hence masculine women and feminine men. I feel like this distinction between gender identity and gender expression is also important to properly understand trans people. Early on in my transition, I had someone tell me that I didn't need to be a trans woman because I could always just be a man who wore dresses and makeup. And she got one thing right, which is that men can, in fact, wear dresses and makeup and still identify as men. That much is true. But being trans isn't a matter of gender expression. It's a matter of gender identity. I'm a trans woman, but I can count on one hand the number of times I've worn makeup in the past 6 months. And while I have started taking a liking to dresses and skirts, I'm typically most comfortable in a t-shirt, flip-flops, and athletic shorts or sweatpants depending on the weather. I'm not a trans woman because of how I dress. I'm a trans woman because I was assigned male at birth, then realized later on that my gender identity is female. And no matter how I choose to express my gender remains constant. Wearing a ball gown, still a girl. Wearing a three-piece suit, still a girl. I feel like I've probably over-explained this, but let's recap just in case. Biological sex refers to a person's biological parameters, their genitalia, gonads, chromosomes, hormones, and secondary sex characteristics. Gender identity, on the other hand, has to do with the way a person understands their sense of self based on the way their brain is wired. Both biological sex and gender identity have been scientifically validated, as has the fact that these two things don't always match up, hence trans people. Gender expression, on the other hand, is a cultural and temporal phenomenon rather than a biological or psychological phenomenon, and has to do with the way that we present ourselves to the world. We can present ourselves as masculine, feminine, androgynous, or some combination thereof, and this also does not have to match up with our biological sex or gender identity. Again, if you have questions, leave them in the comments below. If you're new to this, it can be difficult at first. I'm happy to answer questions. Lastly, we come to sexuality and romantic orientation, both of which have to do with who a person is attracted to. Sexuality, also known as sexual orientation, refers to who a person is sexually attracted to, whereas romantic orientation has to do with who a person is romantically attracted to. Much like sex and gender, sexuality and romantic orientation tend to overlap for many people, but not for everyone. For example, a person who's asexual, someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction, may still experience romantic attraction. And let's say this hypothetical person is a man who's only romantically attracted to men. That would make him a homoromantic asexual. However, if this same homoromantic person also happened to be homosexual, he likely wouldn't call himself a homoromantic homosexual. He would likely just call himself gay. I'll explore different identities and the different ways that romantic orientation and sexuality can overlap in a different video, but for now I think it suffices to say that romantic orientation and sexuality are two closely related elements of a person's identity that both refer to who they happen to be attracted to. One last thing, it's sexuality or sexual orientation, but not sexual preference. The term is outdated, and it also implies that who someone loves is a choice, not an inherent part of who they are. In addition to knowing what each of these aspects of identity are, I think the other important thing to remember is that each of these aspects of identity are independent. Your sex doesn't dictate your sexuality doesn't dictate your gender expression, and your gender expression doesn't dictate your gender identity. We're complex creatures with often complex identities, and I think that's as beautiful as it is exciting. That being said, it can be difficult to wrap your head around complex things, especially if it's something that's new to you. So if you're looking for a simple guide to all of the things I've talked about in this video, I'd recommend looking into the Gender Unicorn. I've talked about it on this channel before, but the Gender Unicorn is essentially a guide to help you visually map out your sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, and romantic orientation. This is what mine looks like, and I'd encourage you to fill out one yourself. Links in the description below. Again, if you have any questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to leave them down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Remember that you're wonderful, and that the world is a better place because you're in it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye!